Good evening, and welcome to One More Story Before 12. Today we're going to do things a little differently. There won't be a regular episode. Instead, I have an interview prepared for you. A very special interview with James Sparks, an AJ instructor and a person who has dabbled in the true crime genre for a good number of years. Included is our conversation. Teaches courses on serial killers in international context, as well as the juvenile justice system. James has been a long member of the community, a long-time member of the community, and I'm very glad that he is here with us tonight. James, thank you for joining us.
Oh, good. More than happy to be here.
Thank you. I suppose the first question, while the most rudimentary, is also the most important one. How did you get into crime? Or true crime, and what made you kind of continue on the career path?
I guess my first experience would be, believe it or not, when I was 9 years old. I remember in December of 1978, reports from Chicago, Illinois, where there's this little ranch-style house in this small little suburb, and they were bringing out these white bags. And I turned to my dad, and I remember asking him, what is that? And he's like, very quietly said, those are bodies. And, we eventually found out that it was John Wayne Gacy. And I went to school, we did the undergraduate thing, and I was a criminal justice major. And while I was there, I began a interest, I guess, in serial murder. And in the back of my head, there was always the issue with John Gacy. So, at one point, I guess it was in 1992, WGN did a miniseries called To Catch a Killer starring Brian Dennehy regarding Gacy. And after the miniseries, I actually was able to see a special report by WGN afterwards that was talking about Gacy. And I actually seen an envelope that had his address, and took the address down, waited a few days, decided to write John a letter, and sent it off and got a response. And after receiving the response, it was sort of, he was, trying to protect himself, I guess, from my initial letter, what I was asking him. And he was like, well, you think you know all this stuff. Why don't you come visit and I can show you all this proof? And after I went to see him, I was pretty much stuck in this field, in this genre. I'd always worked with juveniles and things of that matter, but as far as a serial homicide, that's when it started. And I eventually wrote my master's thesis on John, and I've been involved with the crime field since then. What I do on a daily basis is work with juveniles. The adjunct professor is something I do part-time, but I do teach the classes on serial homicide, the international class and the U.S. class, and it's just been an interest of mine for so many years.
I think it's been an interest not only to you, but I saw for many of your students as well. You've got an excellent rating on Rate My Professor, for instance. But something that I wanted to ask, I suppose, is John Wayne Gacy is such a big name, and yet you had a chance to be very personal with him for a good number of years. Can you tell us a bit about Gacy the person, and how was he different maybe from Gacy the murderer, and if there's even a distinction between those two facets?
Sure. Well, I visited John for 2 years, from 92 through 94. My last visit with him was April 1st of 1994, about a month and 10 days before his execution. And it got to a point where I think I got 12 or 13 visits in with him over a 2-year period, which is actually a lot, driving back and forth to do the visits. And when I first met John, I really didn't know how to take him because, I'd had this image of what I'd seen on television, and I seen the way Brian Dennehy portrayed him, and I expected when I went to the prison to see this, 7-foot giant, gigantic creature menacing, and that was not the case. That was the farthest thing from the truth. And after a while, when I started visiting with Gacy, it was almost like he it was hard to believe that he had been arrested and convicted of all those murders, because he's one of those guys that you could sit down at the table on the prison visits and talk about anything. We talked about baseball. We talked about rock music. We talked about art. We talked about everything. And it was one of those things that I guess I thought about it more and more after he was executed. That to me, I could completely understand how he was able to, in a sense, get the victims and had them put the rope around their neck or had them put the handcuffs on. Because he was one of those charming guys. He was like everybody's favorite uncle that everybody wanted to talk with and, be around. And John just had that personality about him. That's why he was successful. But I can 100% see how he was able to lure the guys in. And that's the scary thing, because he was just an everyday Joe. He was married at one time. He lived in a neighborhood. He was good to his neighbors. He was a successful businessman. And then he had that dark side. Now, the one thing that I also did recognize during the course of the visits, and it's one of those things that I've never met anyone like that since then, is John had absolutely no appreciation for human life. In 1992, when I started visiting, it was like he forgot about that confession statement that he made in December of 1978. He went from confessing to all the murders to, during his prison stay, just actually, I guess, made himself believe that he'd never killed a soul. But the actual non-respect of human life is probably the one thing that bothers me most about John, other than the murder, obviously. But the fact that he just had no appreciation whatsoever for human life.
Would you say that was, and this is maybe playing psychologist or psychiatrist too much, but would you say that was maybe his way of trying to cut himself off from a part of that life, or was he so entrenched in it, but he was still trying to present a face of, or a facade of seeming benign, normal, everyday normalcy to people?
He wanted everyone to believe everything that he said. He was like he forgot that, and I think after being in prison and being incarcerated on death row for 14 years, I think he actually believed by the time before he was executed that he didn't kill anybody. I think he had made himself believe that. But there was still this just sort of bad feeling, in a sense, associated with him. And every once in a while I'd get it. I, on a couple of occasions, took friends with me to visit, and they would usually help me take notes. And, it was either I never want to go back there again, or I'd like to go back again and see how he acts, because you never knew what to expect, and you never knew what personality you were going to get. Now, if it was just me and John one-on-one, it was pretty much the same. But he always liked to put on a big show, and that someone showed up. And I guess probably one of the most disturbing visits that I had was a friend of mine who lives in Indiana came with me to take notes. And when we got there, we usually arrived at the prison at 7 a.m. And it was in Chester, Illinois, Menard Correctional Facility. And we went through the processing and signed in. And by that time, the folks that worked the front desk had got to know me. They knew when I walked in who I was to see. They would, small chit-chat and what have you. Mm-hmm. But we went through, and there was a fellow behind me, and he got processed through, and he go, "Who are you here to see?" And he said, "John Gacy." And I just kind of looked at him, because usually whenever I had a visit, it was my visit or the person I brought, and we never visited or shared a visit with him. And this guy had driven all night from West Virginia to Southern Illinois to visit with John Gacy. And the reason I know that is because he told us, we were actually talking small talk with him outside and had no idea he was going to visit. And then he went in to visit, and we went in there, and John said, "Hey, I hope you don't mind. Such and such wanted to come see me, and I didn't think it'd be a problem." I said, "John, that's fine." But the most disturbing thing about it is this man, who probably at the time was in his 40s, and I was in my 20s, was sitting there, and everything that John said, it was captivating this man. It was like John had become this father figure to this man, and he was holding on every word that he said. And that right there was just another one of those situations that was probably more disturbing to me than anything I'd heard or saw to that point.
It's the ability to almost disarm and I guess invite into his world, which is the interesting part is because that John Wayne Gacy certainly had that effect on people. And when you mention that statement, I guess it goes to show how people think that they'll be able to sometimes recognize a killer, or that there's a very specific, almost neon arrow pointing at someone and saying, "This is who I am and this is what I do." But they don't sometimes, I think, realize that it comes under the guise of the friendly uncle or your next door neighbor, or seemingly the most simplest, charming, most individuals.
Exactly. Unfortunately, there's no big sign on their head or on their chest or a tattoo that identifies them as such. And that's why he was able to just sort of, exist in public, just like many of them are. I think I shared with you earlier, talking about David Gore a few weeks ago when we talked. And when I was corresponding with David Gore, and he was a serial killer, a teen killer in Florida with his cousin, and he was convicted and eventually executed. But David would, 100% go into detail about killing his victims. And he was talking about what he did. I said, "Well, how did you get victims?" And he said, "It was easy." He said, "I always, drove around in my van." And, we're talking about the van that has no windows. It's almost like a painter's van. He said, "When I park in a neighborhood, usually on a cul-de-sac, one way in, one way out." And he goes, "I'd park on that, and I would basically, before he decided to park there, he would sort of like gauge the area, sometimes weeks at a time. And what he would do is he would pull in, stop, open the van door, and have a box in the back of the van." And I was like, well, what was in the box?" And he said, "I had a box of puppies." And he said it was the easiest way for me to get victims because no gal could turn down the chance to hold or hug a puppy. And he said once they got in his van, he would hit them in the head with a hammer, shut the door, and then take off. And they had no clue.
It's frightening how easy sometimes it is to, I guess, almost play on the most basic instincts of, of any person so easily like that.
Absolutely. And I share that with my students, whenever we start the class. Right now we're doing a lot of online classes and there are a lot of Zoom classes. And I do this part-time, being an instructor, but I always take quite a bit of time, usually in the intro class or the first official class. And I talk about safety. And I gear it towards the young ladies, but these days it can be geared towards the young fellas too. But I told them, I was like, don't take things for granted. Make sure that when you're out, don't walk down a street that doesn't have a light. Make sure when you leave and you're ready to go to your car when you leave class, you have your keys in your hand. Are you traveling in groups? Because anything's possible these days. We should know that from the television shows and the movies that have been put out about serial killers are the things that we find out when they're arrested. And you just can't take anything for granted these days. Unfortunately, it's not a safe world.
No, but I would also say, and maybe this is just my perception, that serial killers are still very much among us, but that number, or maybe that notoriety, has gone down since the 70s, the 80s, or even the 90s. I feel like there is a bigger pool of people who are aware of this. And of course, you still have people like Israel Keys, for instance, but I feel like that number has decreased, or at least it's not spoken about as publicly anymore. Would you say that's also your perception?
Yeah, I'll say that, probably in the mid 80s, late 80s, that's when we had the explosion, the serial killer explosion in a sense. And, every magazine you picked up, every time you turn on the television, it was, something about a serial murder. Since then, things have slowed down in a sense. Now, there are still, like you said, serial killers among us. They're out there. They just haven't been caught. And I always tell that to my students. I was like, just because you don't hear about it doesn't mean that they're not there. I said, you can bet your last dollar that right now, as we're in this class, there's someone in their house sitting around the table with a bunch of headless corpses talking to them. And I said, they just haven't been caught yet. But, there is sort of a peak in times with Netflix coming out and doing the Ted Bundy thing, and then you got Mindhunter and different stories like that, and then you've got ID and all the things they're trying to do the cash in a sense, on the serial murder. But as far as something that's, I guess, um, common, no, not so much as it was in the 80s.
I also noticed, and this might just be my perception of it, but a lot of women, especially young women, are very much into the whole matter. And I noticed that almost disproportionately the ratio is a lot higher. I think, and it's just my observation, that I think a lot of women take some very important lessons from that as well, almost as a kind of guide of here's what to look out for, here's what I should be, keeping an eye out if I do see some red flags in someone. Would you say that that also is something you might have encountered or seen?
I think that they're more aware. And then, like I said, I go through my little speech in class and talk to them, and I get a lot of comments about it. And it seems that some of the information or the ideas that they have developed may have come from inaccurate information in movies and shows and stuff like that. So we kind of clear that up. But I do think that some are more aware. Generally, when I have my class, whether it be the intro U.S. serial killer class or the international class, generally it's about 90 to 95% female students every semester when I teach it. So there is an interest, and maybe it's sort of one of those things where they want to know more about it, or maybe it's one of those things that, hey, this is a phenomenon. I want to be aware of it, and I want to avoid being one of those victims.
I I was once talking a few days ago with a friend of mine, and we were just going back and forth on how the kind of serial killer culture is still very much part of our daily lives. People are interested about it. They read about it, watch films, movies, podcasts, videos, what have you. And somebody mentioned that there's an unhealthy obsession with it now. But when you look back, even to newspapers from the 30s, 20s, or even reports from the 19th century, people were still very much interested in these cases. In fact, the description in papers would often be even more lurid and repulsive than what you'd find printed today, I feel.
Oh, absolutely. You know, serial killers are part of Americana, in a sense, if you will. They've been around forever. There's always going to be an interest. It's not one of those things that's just going to go away. I think that where we get into the problem is whenever we focus on the exploitation and it doesn't become a mechanism to educate or to provide knowledge, but an opportunity for those that will to make a dollar or a dime or a mint off of somebody's misfortune. And I'm not talking about the serial killer per se, but I'm talking about the victims. Because a lot of times when this happens, we forget about the victims. And that's the sad part about this. You know, the realm right now is political based and everything's geared towards that. And I've noticed that whenever there is a serial homicide or a multiple murder, it's almost got to the point where it's just a tiny little blip on the back of a paper, and there still are papers in existence, or even just stories online. It's just tiny blips. I don't think that we're ever going to get rid, or there's going to be a shortage of serial killer culture, quotation. I just think it's how one, I guess, promotes it in a sense. Mm-hmm. I'm not trying to be vague about it, but I think there's a responsibility for people to know about that, and there are certain, talented directors out there and producers that can make us aware of it, and even good newscasters. But sometimes we lose sight of the actual real problem, and it becomes dollars instead of saving lives.
It can also be a very kind of fine line at times. I remember when My Friend Dahmer came out, based, of course, on the graphic novel, a few years ago. I think it was 3 or 4. And I saw the film, and I didn't think it was particularly well put together. And I'm talking strictly about it as a film. It felt very kind of TV movie-ish, very sort of scrubbed clean in a bizarre way. And again, I understand that's the time period it was at, but I noticed that, strangely enough, an earlier film from the 90s called The Secret Life of Jeffrey Dahmer, which was much more notorious at its release, labeled to be an exploitation film. The bodies weren't even cold yet, and that sort of thing when it came out, and yet it resonated much more than me, even though it was a very cheap production and a very sleazy sort of film. It somehow stuck in my mind more just because it gave me that uncomfortable feeling almost.
That's it's funny you bring it up because that actually is one of the first, I guess, films in that genre. And I think was it Jeffrey? Oh, the guy that's on the Avengers. I think that's one of his first films.
Oh, Jeremy Renner, yeah.
Yeah, and to be honest with you, I love that film. I thought they did such a great job because it was low budget, but it was almost what to expect. And it was like, this is more doco style to me than actual production. I know that may sound crazy, but I was like, this is actually a good piece of art as far as we're talking about Jeffrey Dahmer. The picture that you mentioned, I have not even seen it because so many of my friends have told me, hey, don't waste your time. Don't. It's just not worth the effort. And I've even never picked up the graphic novel. I don't know anything about it. But the early one, yeah, I really enjoyed that. I thought they did a job.
The novel I was quite fond of, but the movie I wouldn't necessarily recommend. It was just fell flat, and I'm speaking more, I guess, in artistic and technical interpretations of the material, how it just felt kind of very rudimentary. But again, that's just my opinion on the matter.
Yeah. Well, it's sort of like the Netflix Mindhunter. I'm sure you've watched it.
Yes.
And to be honest with you, I think, I don't know how long it's been out, a couple of years, but I know that I was so far behind because I refused to watch it because I had my impression and I knew who the profilers in a sense were based on. I knew, that it was some of the top people from the behavioral science unit, and I was so afraid that they were going to have too much artistic, I guess, freedom and endeavor on, one individual who I actually met, who's deceased, who was in the behavioral science unit, was a great person, and I just thought that it was just going to be more, the Hollywood twist on it.
Mm-hmm.
And then I finally took the time. Me and my wife actually sat down one Sunday afternoon, actually about 2 or 3 in the afternoon, and started watching it. And I remember we binged the entire thing because I was like, man, they actually took time to do the research, and they didn't discredit some of these early pioneers from the behavioral science unit that I was so fond of and respected. So, I was kind of let down when I heard that they weren't going to do a season 3. But I think some of the homework that they put into it, they did a good job. Now, I don't feel that same way with all of them. I think the one about Bundy, I started watching, and it was basically almost like they were reading out of the book, that original book. I can't remember if it was, I can't remember what book it came from, but I remember that because I had actually used that book as a source whenever I wrote my graduate thesis on Gacy. I used it as one of the sources because of some of the information that they had put in there in regards to a sort of a common characteristic among serial killers.
This might interest you then. David Fincher recently said that there is a possible season 3 in the works of Mindhunter. He's not putting the kibosh on it entirely. He's just not sure when he'd get around to it, but there's a very big possibility that it would come back for a 3rd season.
Well, if they do, I would hope, and I know if you've watched it, did you get a chance to watch it?
Yes.
I think, towards the last part of the 2nd season, they started showing the film board behind them with sort of like the photos, and one of the photos on there was Patrick Kearney. And I thought that would have been one of the profiles in season 3. And if they do that, I will just be, I guess, really intrigued and excited at the same time, because that is one of those cases that has little information about it. Patrick's still alive, he's in his early 80s.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just one of those cases that sort of got swept under the rug and no one knows about it. But, he was one of the early, quote, trash bag killers from Southern California.
Correct.
And no one knows about that case, and that blows my mind every time I bring up Patrick Kearney. no one knows who Kearney is. And
He
he's actually a big one.
he is, and I think he's in his. He'd have to be in what, in his 80s, I think at this point. But I think he's still incarcerated in California. I don't know if they've ever moved him. But he's also one of those people that kind of slipped through the cracks. It's like, why did somebody else kind of get the notoriety and the infamy, and individuals like this kind of fall through the cracks and are forgotten to time?
Yeah, and exactly. It's some of the same characteristics. You got Pat Kearney, you got Bill Bonin, you got Larry Eiler, you got Randy Kraft, and Southern Illinois and Indiana, all pretty much doing the same sort of murders. But Kearney, like you said, just slipped through the cracks. And the thing that's so amazing to me about that is I think one of Patrick's victims was, 5. And I was like, that's pretty big deal that you sort of don't place any focus on that. Because, some of Bonin's were teenagers in early 20s.
Mm-hmm.
But Kearney was low-age victims. And you would, if that happened today, could you imagine the uprising and the backlash for that?
It's sort of strange that a crime, usually if a child is the victim of an attack that's perpetrated on them, that case already becomes sort of infamous. But I feel like a lot of people tend to almost exclude minor victims. People forget that Bundy had underage victims, Dahmer had underage victims. People remember names like Albert Fish, but they don't remember Gordon Stewart Northcott, for instance.
Right. And, even with Bundy, I think Kim Leach was the last victim, the 12-year-old.
Mm-hmm.
That's the one that actually got him the death penalty, per se. But prior to that, there was little focus, you're right, on that. But, I think, Kearney's youngest victim was 5. And that's, I'm actually surprised that he has still maintained his ability to live in the prison, and I can only just assume that no one knows about his case, that he's so old. Like I said, he's 80, 81, 82, somewhere around in there. That most of the guys who are incarcerated now don't know anything about the case.
I think it's also that time where a lot of these older names are starting to pass. Case in point, last week the Yorkshire Ripper finally passed, age 70 I think it was, and we're starting to see now a lot of these names that were once known or somewhat known now kind of fade away, and I think a lot of that notoriety has sort of faded from people's mind, and it isn't until when they pass on that people go, oh right, he was still alive, for instance.
Yeah, everyone forgets about Peter. They thought that, whenever it came out that he had passed away, I think COVID related, most of the people I know was like, he's still alive? I thought he died a long time ago. And I was like, no, a lot of these people that you think are dead are still alive. Kearney, Kenneth Bianchi, David Berkowitz, a lot of those guys are still around. And the thing about it is those early serial killers, there's not very many of them left. And then there's always the ones, that committed just as many crimes that you don't know about. Even like from the mass murder standpoint, case of Robert Benjamin Smith. How is that not one of the biggest crimes that we know about? At the time, I think it was 66, 67, that was a big deal. And no one knows who Robert Benjamin Smith is. If you ask today, they have no idea. They're going to say, oh, is that the guy in The Cure? They have no idea who Smith is.
I think it depends who gets their kind of name into the spotlight first. There's, of course, I always think of Charles Whitman and how he's also been kind of dubbed the first mass shooter. And yet people forget in my home state of New Jersey, Howard Unruh was technically the first, his infamous walk of death in Camden.
And it was a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
It was very big. And, it was just sort of like you said, it was just kind of forgotten about. Whereas Whitman got all the notoriety. Who was it? Mark David Essex in New Orleans on the Howard Johnsons, out of the Navy, and was just a sniper in of all places, New Orleans, Louisiana. there's many of those guys, but I always tend to find out too that when we talk about the mass murderers, they never get sort of the play that the serial killers do. And a lot of times, in the very beginning, there was a confusion among folks about the definitions because mass murder was sort of like a catch-all, you know, because I've heard Ted Bundy being called a mass murderer, and there is a difference, and they people were just not educated, and that goes back to like the early '70s or so, because no one knew what it was about until we hit that serial killer, pop culture area of the '80s. Because I think really one of the first terms used to describe serial murder was the term multicide, and I think that's from back in the early '80s or '70s. And then even the River, I think in the late '50s, was it '58 or '59, talked about lust killing as a component of a hedonist serial killer,
Based on the German Lustmord, if I recall, yes?
Yes, and a lot of people aren't aware of that. It's just one of those things where it's almost like what we are given is, in a sense, edited and controlled until they want us to know about it. And I'm not trying to be paranoid or anything like that, but it would be one of those things that if you've got a crime like serial murder or serial killings, you would think that you would want to educate the public and let them know. Because look at people like Jess Person or the fellow out in Nashville. I think he's incarcerated there now. They were truck drivers. How hard is it to catch a truck driver serial killer? Think about it. They're moving around the country 7 days a week. And that's why I would venture to say that right now we've got probably several on the road. We just haven't caught them yet.
I think they've also become more savvy. You can't go to a 7-Eleven, for Christ's sakes, to get a candy bar without a camera recording your every move. So, unless we're talking very rural areas or somewhere out in the wilderness, most cities, even somewhat decently sized towns, have monitoring almost everywhere. So it becomes almost impossible for a bigger body count to amass at some point.
Yeah, and I guess with that being said, even though the media is our form of education, it also educates them too. Hey, this is how this guy got caught. I don't want to be the one that gets caught the same way. Let me just be a little more, I guess, careful about what I want to do. And like you said, got to watch the cameras.
One thing I do want to bring up before we head out and finish the interview, I wanted to mention that you have, of course, written to many inmates over the years. And one in particular that I'm very interested in is Dennis Nilsen, of course. Can you tell us a bit how you got started writing to him?
Sure. I actually, when I first started writing Des, it was I'd written to him a couple times and no luck. Wrote some nice letters, asked a little bit about the case, and was hopefully anticipating a response. And a couple letters, went, and there was no response. So what I decided to do, and someone had mentioned to me, is like, hey, next time you write a letter to him, why don't you send a stamp with it? And, being in the States, it was very difficult to find stamps, for him to mail out of the UK. So I had a friend who actually was a flight attendant, and he would go to London, and when he came back through, he would buy me stamps. So I basically sit down and write another letter to Des and include a stamp, and lo and behold, about 3 or 4 weeks after I sent my letter off, I get a response from him. And the thing that I actually miss our correspondence because Des was, and that's what he went by, Des, always signed that off in his letters. Dennis Nilsen, he was one of those guys that was very, very kind in his letters and opinionated, but he could talk about any subject. Great correspondence. He would put little pieces of poems that he has written. He would talk about the justice system. He'd talk about the prison system. But he would also talk about growing up in a sense. And he would talk about family. And he would talk about his time when he was in the military. And talk about how much those guys meant to him in the military. He says they were all brothers. He said there was no color of skin difference. He said we were all brothers. And, he was very, very concerned about inmate rights as well as um, gay rights in the prison system and even the country and in the United States, because I would mention things that were happening in the South in regards to gay and lesbian issues and just topics that were just blowing my mind that people could be treated this way. And Dez always had, he always had an opinion on it, but it was one of those opinions that, in a sense, made the most sense. He thought about what he wrote. He just didn't put a bunch of gibberish. He was very big into the British politics, though, and he could also be very kind. I remember whenever my dad passed away, he wrote me a very nice letter in regards to that, and it was really nice. You say, why would you want that? But when you go through the loss of a parent, anything that's positive is welcoming, and I appreciated it, and I told him I appreciated it. And then he would ask about my mother and things like that, how she was doing and stuff like that. It wasn't just like one of those people that you would think were, a nut job and didn't care or nothing like that. He actually, in our letters, seemed like he was concerned and wanted to know what was going on, how my work was going, and things like that. And in turn, I would ask him about the prison and how his days were going. Was he still working? He used to smoke, and then I think they finally made him quit smoking. He was more concerned about various movements popping up in the prison system because he felt that some inmates were getting more, rights than he was. But it was something that was never inappropriate. He never wrote any vulgarity to me or anything like that. And every once in a while he'd say a curse word in a joke or something like that. But it was a very appropriate correspondence. And I remember asking him a few times about History of a Drowning Boy. And Des one time replied, he goes, they won't let me have the ability to write my biography. And then I wrote again about it, just hoping that he would say something. And he basically completely ignored it altogether. And he used to be, tit for tat whenever correspondence. If I'd write out a series of things, he would literally go down the line and answer every one of them. But that last time I asked him about History of a Drowning Boy, he just passed it altogether.
I do know that History of a Drowning Boy will be released in the UK and I think worldwide in February of 2021, but I don't know how much of the original notebook manuscript is going to be included. It's about 300 and some odd pages, and from what I know, there were tons and tons of loose leaf notebooks written, like 16 or something I once heard. So I think it's going to be a very condensed, edited version, and I don't know if we'll ever see the full kind of uncut book, as it were.
I'm the same way. I don't think we'll ever know the truth in regards to that. I think it's been probably spliced together, and I don't think you're going to get every bit of that manuscript. If there are actually 14, 15, 16 journals out there, we'll never know everything. I really want to know if they do cover the childhood stuff, because that's just an important aspect of it for me, from some of the things that I teach in my course. But I'd also like to know about the killing for company, in a sense. And I know that's just sort of, hopping on Master's title. But I would like to know some of the thought process of what, Des supposedly said, or the reason being. And I'm just afraid that whenever we see that book in February 2021, so 4 months from now?
Yeah.
I want to be optimistic, but I think that we're going to be disappointed when it finally comes out.
I'm inclined to agree. I'm always kind of latching on to hope that, some death is better than no death at all. But I also feel that it's going to be sort of kind of combed over with a fine-tooth comb, and here's what's appropriate and here's what isn't appropriate, which I find even, more odd is that Ian Brady was able to put out his, more ridiculous literature with no censorship whatsoever.
Well, that's obvious. And there's no, obviously, editorial process to it as well. As many grammatical errors and complete just total shit, excuse my French, in regards to the book. How could you get that out? And how could, he have sold so many copies? And I think that when it comes to comparing those two, Dennis had so much more to offer in regards to the topic of serial murder and just the whole psyche of it than what Ian Brady. Ian Brady was just you know, and I corresponded with Ian a couple of times, but it was just so all about me, 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 me. You know, it was just everything had to be about him. Whereas I think Dez is a little different, and I think that what I would like to find out is how much time Dez, if he did, focus on his relationship with his partner that he had before he started the killing.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I want to know about. I want to know what happened. What was the straw that broke the camel's back, or was there anything? But I think, as important as that fellow was to him, I think that he would have taken the time to write about it, and that's what I want to know about. It's like, what happened, you know, and maybe we'll never know.
I saw a bit of the footage from the home movies. Some of it's available online, and I saw a very different portrayal of a person. And reading a lot of Nilsen's letters or writings, poems, even looking at some of his artwork, I always, not that I want to dramatize needlessly, but I always felt there was something much more to him as an individual, and that maybe a lot of this could have been avoided. Where did that wrong turn happen? While reading a lot of Ian Brady stuff, to be a little more blunt, I said, my God, this man must truly love himself and go to bed every night thinking, I'm the smartest individual on the face of the earth. A pompous jackass, completely. I found, at least.
A malignant narcissist.
Mm-hmm.
Is the best way to describe Brady. And I wish that, you know, I had actually had the time to reach out to Myra when she was alive, because I think that I would have had a better understanding of it, because I think some of the things that I've seen about Myra and read about Myra, I think that she was shooting straight at the end, and I would have loved to have her complete evaluation or quotation mark psychological profile of Ian while I was writing him. Because yes, it was all about him. Everything had to be about him. I remember one time in a letter, he's like, "Hey, you need to find this one thing, and it would be really cool for you to have." And he went into great detail about how Marilyn Manson had, you know, when you go to a show and they have a lot of concert posters and stuff like that. He just went on and on and on about how Marilyn Manson had a concert poster with his face on it, and I guess because it was Marilyn Manson, I guess he thought that he had just achieved superstardom. So I found that very odd that he would just take any chance he had just to promote himself.
I guess in his mind it was, look at me, I've made it. I've now transcended from crimedom into the music industry. You know, my face is being used on for posters or memorabilia or what have you not.
Maybe so. You know, sort of like him in the feeding tube, how they said, you know, he'd been in the feeding tube for so long, and then you would hear stories about when the nurses would come in and they would find the toast that he'd eaten, or, you know, the coffee and tea, and how he said he never touched that stuff, and they would find all the remnants left of it. And I was like, yeah, you're on a hunger strike, all right. You know, I do find it, though, very, still, you know, even after his passing, disturbing that he wasn't willing to give the location of the kid that, you know, that they were looking for. And, you know, the poor kid's mother passed away without knowing anything. Now, there was some rumors saying that one of his pen pals actually was giving a letter that had the location and stuff like that. But how long has he been dead? And we haven't heard anything yet.
I don't know if they'll ever find the missing child on the moors. Plus, the moors themselves, I think, shift so often that who knows where. I'm sure that body is somewhere there. The problem is who wants to put in the time and the expense. Unfortunately,
it is just lost. Unfortunately.
To circle back really quickly to Nilsen, there's two little pieces I wanted to read. I happen to have a letter that you wrote to Nilsen, and I just wanted to compare his, I guess, wording. he wrote in one letter to you, "The duty of any nation is to educate and upgrade employable skills to its young people. If it can't do that, then it has failed and can't do anything. I am quite amazed how many of the younger generations can read or don't read well and never read books or any serious literature, being children of the total TV and computer games generation and all its attending. So these developing kids are denied interpersonal social skills, and they slowly become more and more estranged for the ups and downs of real life as they cling to their chosen comfort zones." Beautifully written, quite profound. And here's an example of a letter somebody wrote to Nilsen, and it's a little bit more blunt. "You also ask if prison life is treating you well. Prison life is not designed to treat anybody well. Over the last year, 102 prisoners did not kill themselves in prison because they were having a great time. There is no Christmas here, no trees or decorations. If Santa came down the chimney here, he would get mugged or thrown into a strip cell." And I think it's just sort of funny to see that comparison letter-wise, how if somebody put in the time and effort, he was able to respond beautifully, paragraph upon paragraph, on various points, while on some other issues he was almost dismissive, you could say.
Yeah, and I think that's, in a sense, if there is such a word as, being able to be friends through correspondence. I was very passionate, and still am, about my, daily job of working with juveniles. And I think that when I wrote to him at the time, I was very frustrated about something that had happened, I think, here in the South in regards, and that's where I live, in the South, in regards to a case that was relating to a juvenile. And what you read is an example of how, whenever you asked a question, how he put 100% into it. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. It was like he wanted to provide his insight because he knew that it was important to me. And I truly believe that. And I think that he was just sort of like, shedding some more light onto it, and saying, hey, this is because of a lack of this, and this. Because I had, given some insight as to, what I thought was a problem. And it was just like when I mentioned earlier when my father passed away. He really wrote a really sweet letter. He didn't have to do that. He could have said, sorry for your loss and moved on. But he did. He sort of spent some time and said that. And then, taking that letter about, prison's supposed to be tough and stuff like that, I think it goes back, again, to who he was corresponding with. Because Des, I think, he would always send a Christmas card. He missed 1 year, I think, in the 5 or 6 years that we were corresponding. And I think he was sick at the time when I didn't get one. But he would bring up Christmas all the time, when it was close. He's like, it looks like we'll get the same old food. They give us this and this extra on Christmas. But it was probably his response to the way someone had sent him a letter. And it was probably nasty and inappropriate, so he's just going to be quick and short and to the point. But then, he had that crazy sense of humor as well, so who knows? Needless to say, that fella probably not, or gal probably didn't get too many responses from him after that.
No, I think Des literally mentions in the letter that he's only responding back because posted was included. Otherwise, he wouldn't have even bothered.
Yeah.
And I guess that's what's most interesting reading is that, you see a lot of facets to him, that sense of humor, his very strong sense of justice, how he was, even in prison, somehow still the civil servant, always till the end. And he's just a fascinating, I think, character. And it's interesting to see him undergo a current revival. Now with the TV show, now with his biography, or in whatever form it's going to be, being released, and the constant renewal in Brian Masters' book as well. So it's kind of interesting to see his kind of legacy live on more and more.
Yeah, it really is. And, he's another one of those that was sort of bypassed, and I think we should have found out more about him, even in the States. Over there it was a big deal, but he's one of those, there's plenty of information about Ian Brady, and I'm always surprised how Dennis Nilsen didn't have just as much attention until, like you said, within the past 6 months. And I still haven't seen the little miniseries. I want to take some time to watch that, but I haven't. The reviews that I've seen on it have sort of been mixed. You either like it or you hate it. So I don't know where I'll stand.
I personally enjoyed it. Not perfect, though. There were some little more pacing issues, I felt, and uneven kind of screen time. But then again, with a miniseries, maybe you're only given so much time. It's a short series too. It's 3 episodes, 45 minutes each.
Okay. Yeah.
So, but it's definitely worth the look just to kind of see how he's viewed now in a modern lens. And I think if there's a highlight, it is that David Tennant does a phenomenal job portraying him.
I did hear that. I heard he was excellent. So I'm looking forward to that, actually.
Okay, and that is all the time that we have for tonight. I just wanted to thank you once more for joining us for this interview.
Oh, absolutely. Anytime. My pleasure.
Thank you so much.